Good morning and welcome. Tristan, do you have the gavel? Good morning. I know, where's Tristan? Where's the gavel? Good morning and welcome. Good morning and welcome. My name is Rashad Massoud MPH, class of 1993. I am a past president of the Harvard Chan Alumni Association, and currently I'm an HAA graduate school director representing the Harvard Chan School of Public Health within the university-wide Alumni Association. I just started as a visiting faculty member here at Harvard Chan. In my previous work, I was the chief program officer for a not-for-profit called AmeriCares, where amongst other responsibilities, I oversaw the emergency response program. Last year, we responded to 45 emergencies here in the US as well as around the world. I was also chief medical and quality officer at a university research company where I directed USAID's global quality improvement mechanisms, the Healthcare Improvement Project and the ASSIST project. I was also a senior vice president at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. Today's first panel is titled Crisis: The Public Health Consequences of War and Conflict. To talk about this, we have three fantastic panelists: Satchit Balsari, Phuong Pham, and Michael VanRooyen. I will ask them each to introduce themselves. Please, Satchit, would you start?
Thank you. I'm an emergency physician at BI and faculty here at Global Health and Population. I work largely in the section of emerging technologies and complex humanitarian emergencies and disasters. I've been largely attached to Jennifer Leaning's work for the last 20 years and Mike's. Really glad to be back at HSPH. I'm a 2002 alum and was in New York for way too long, and I've been back for 5-6 years. I'm thrilled to be back.
Welcome back. Phuong, you would please.
Hi, I'm a social epidemiologist by training. I am a faculty member in the Global Health Department as well as the medical school. I focus a lot on post-conflict. I started out there when I was helping support developing schools of public health after genocide, like in Rwanda and DRC and Vietnam. And what we found working through that was every time we put a new health clinic, there would be war that would outbreak or incidents that would undo everything we did. So I switched my research to look at the impact of conflicts on health, and then I also, in doing all this research, I also co-founded a software called Global Toolbox, which is now a widely used software in the humanitarian field.
And last but not least, please, Michael.
Hi, welcome. Really good to see everybody. My gosh, so great to be in person. So rare and wonderful. So thank you for coming, and it's really a privilege to be here. My name is Mike VanRooyen. I have two jobs. I'm the founder and director of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. It's based at the School of Public Health, but it's a cross-university initiative that engages with NGOs, UN, and partners around the world to advance the science and evidence-based in the humanitarian sector. And so we have work in virtually every conflict area around the world. And then my sort of second job is I'm the chief of emergency services for the Mass General Brigham system. So I oversee Mass General, Brigham, and the 7 additional hospital systems half a million patients a year that require emergency services. That's the sort of the day job too. But it's delightful to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have a few questions to ask you. So if I could start with you, Satchit. Your team at Crisis Ready has been working with humanitarian agencies around the world since the pandemic to advance data-driven decision-making during public health emergencies. Could you talk more about this work? In particular, what challenges do you see in using data in such times of uncertainty?
No challenges at all. AI will fix everything. Crisis Ready was born out of work with a colleague of mine, Caroline Bucky, in the Department of Epidemiology, and you know, during the pandemic, if you remember that these scorecards that companies were putting out, commenting on how people were social distancing, you know, Wyoming's doing great and Utah's not. It was very helpful when we had nothing but non-pharmaceutical measures, you know, travel restrictions, lockdowns. But the policy that people should not move is not the same as whether people were moving or not. And the only objective way to measure whether or not there was any difference in movement was to monitor them, and one could in this day and age with cell phones. Except who has cell phones and who's got the apps on the smartphones that actually generate these signals? Who's counted, who's not counted, who's left out, what about representativeness, uncertainty, bias, and so on. We were a network of about 70 scientists and policymakers that got together in early 2020 and literally would be on the phone with government agencies every evening, helping them sort of make sense of all these, you know, curves and slopes and, you know, hammers that were being broadcast on Twitter every day. All people wanted to know was, you know, travel restrict or not, lockdown or not, and the answers were never simple. Fast forward another year or so, and what emerged from that is this sort of framework that we organized ourselves around in a project called Crisis Ready. Our website is crisisready.io, and it's an initiative anchored here at Harvard and the humanitarian relief organization Direct Relief, where we said the way we need to think about how we apply data in war and conflict and emergencies is around data readiness, methods readiness, and translational readiness. And data readiness, because a lot of the data that we need are now with private corporations, you know, whether it's Meta or Google, or even government agencies who don't know where these data are, mostly around the world. It takes about 2 years to negotiate these DOA agreements between, you know, Harvard lawyers and large corporation lawyers. And so we cannot do this in the middle of a conflict. We need to pre-prepare, pre-negotiate access to these data, even if this spigot is not turned on, right? But you need an arrangement that says, in case of an emergency, you will share these data. The methods piece is a hard piece, and that's not scalable because there are very few institutions in the world that have resources to do the kind of sophisticated analysis it takes to merge your GIS layers with remote sensing, with social mobility data, with other public health indicators. And then the translational piece, even if you have fantastic analysis, there's seldom capacity in government agencies, even in the United States, to be able to take what you're giving them and to apply it to decision-making during crises. And so to operationalize all this, what we've done is sort of set up a federated network of regional hubs that have been seed funded by Crisis Ready, where local scientists and scholars work with us on the methods readiness piece. We take the responsibility of preparing the data pipelines, cleaning the data, and have these large open source differentially private data sets available for use by scholars around the world. The translational piece is working with agencies right from the beginning so that they know that when they want data, they have access to teams that can provide them that. So I'll end with, because we're talking about war and conflict, example from a recent work in Ukraine, where in order to support UN agencies and humanitarian organizations, so we're trying to get a sense of where people were fleeing across the border and where resources need to get allocated. We brought the mayors of all the neighboring towns to Budapest and worked with local scientists to help them understand how to use mobility data from social media companies and cell phone towers in a way in which it is safe, secure, doesn't threaten individual or group privacy, and yet is useful for resource allocation. We think that federating the methods piece and having a pool of scientists and sort of not hoarding data here at Harvard or MIT or Duke or Stanford is really the way to sort of sustain translational work. And we think that is the future of how data are likely to be accessible.
Wonderful, thank you. Phuong, if I can ask you the next question. You and your team have created the Peaceful Data Portal, and you based it on systematic assessments of affected populations in crisis. You've done that over a couple of decades in over 15 countries. What do you see as the key demographic and health consequences of violent conflict on populations?
Thank you so much. And it's so interesting to hear your work. And, I think we know that war and conflicts, happens when there's imbalances and inequality in society, right? And so we know, I think we're watching what's happening right now in Tigray, Ethiopia, and Ukraine. We know that it kills, it injures, and it creates a traumatized society. But it also separates people, right? It separates families. So you see in Ukraine, when people are fleeing, they're separated from, the men who are not permitted. So there's a lot of separations. And so there's a lot of invisible outcomes that I think we don't look at, especially in public health. And one is the social asset that people have, right? People, when we live in these countries, our biggest asset is our social asset. That's how we, get along. And COVID separate all of us, right? And it's so great to be in person, to see people, and that's what connects us, and that's what keeps us healthy. And so people don't look at that, but I think it's a really good indicator for looking at resiliency in a community, whether we can, withstand some of the trauma that we are faced during conflicts. And it's also something where I think technology is also helping us, right? So I think people, especially in conflicts, we don't look at people access to social network, but also have access to Wi-Fi and simple things as internet, right? Because that helps them survive and overcome some of the trauma that they're faced. The other thing that they lose and we don't monitor very much, and we monitor quite a bit because it's a predictor of how those society rebuild themselves, is their sense of control over their lives, because they lose a lot of that. They lose that during the conflicts, and we don't measure that. And so our team measures, the normal, the mortality, the injuries, the exposure to violence, but we also measure people's sense of control over their life, because that's an indicator of how well they're going to bounce back and how well they're going to rebuild. And then, and that gives us a sense of how we can also deliver aids and health support. And I think this is why you see a major shift in the humanitarian sphere, looking at cash transfer. The last thing, and I think this is where I think we're seeing this in COVID in the US, but people trust in the authority and institutions break down too. And it's so hard to reestablish that, but that is so essential in rebuilding the health system and rebuilding healthcare. And we saw that in DRC with the Ebola outbreak, right? When there wasn't trust, and we delivered these, new vaccines and new treatments, people didn't, grasp onto them. They didn't line up for those vaccines. They didn't line up to go to the treatment center. And that's because their trust was broken. So those are a couple of things that we see that are invisible when we look at and looking at the measure of the public health impacts of war on populations.
Thank you. And Michael, as head of the emergency medicine enterprise at Mass General and Women's Hospitals, and the director of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, you've led major programs that have responded to crises globally. What threats do you see to healthcare and healthcare workers during crisis?
Yeah, thank you. So first, to back way up a little bit, war is the greatest de-developer of our time. It's the most rapid de-developer of our time. So when we think about what the progress that countries make or nations make in establishing all services, economic services, everything else, including healthcare, war is the most rapid, profound de-developer that we have. And what happens is that economic systems are broken, social systems are broken, people are marginalized, there's hyper vulnerability of populations and migration. But also healthcare systems are broken, and they're broken for a lot of reasons. Some of those are because there's direct threats to healthcare workers, because healthcare is politicized, because there are no resources, there's no supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. So the challenge, I think, in addressing emergency health systems, both in real-time humanitarian crises and also kind of in the long tail of addressing chronic instability, is actually, I believe, the erosion of neutrality. And that is that we have organizations that are not the development organizations so much, but the relief organizations, Doctors Without Borders, the UN agencies like UNHCR, World Food Program, et cetera. There's an entire multi-billion-dollar enterprise that helps to try to stabilize a population emergently and then actually get them towards rehabilitation. That is directly threatened by the lack of neutrality. 20 years ago, when I was in the field and working in the field, I could have a white, MSF T-shirt on and drive a vehicle and go through borders and get around the way that I needed to because I was a relief worker, and therefore I was neutral. That now is a target on your back, and that target on your back, if you're an NGO, a non-governmental organization, or a UN agency, you are now a target rather than seen as a neutral party. And the genie's out of the bottle. That's not going to change. And so the idea that we can actually intervene in stabilizing populations in conflict and then be in an area and be seen as a neutral, helpful participant in rehabilitation ain't there anymore. And so one of the big problems and biggest threats, back to the initial question, is I think the lack of perceived neutrality of the humanitarian enterprise as a helpful resource, as opposed to being politicized and targeted, and directly targeted actually, as whether it's the health sector or anything else. So neutrality and the erosion of neutrality in the humanitarian sphere is the big thing, in my opinion.
Thank you. Satchit, if I can come back to you, how do you see climate change escalating political and societal tensions? A lot of your work is in Asia, South Asia, and the region in the past few months has seen several heat waves and floods. What types of public health challenges do you anticipate in that circumstance?
Rashad, I think we saw in Pakistan as a harbinger for what's going to happen in South Asia. Even if our conservative projections are true, you are facing in Bangladesh sea level rise on a longer time scale, and the more acute time scale we'll see more cyclones and floods. And Bangladesh is very flat, right? So there is it's not easy to retreat upwards. In Middle India, and we saw this with the heat waves, before the Pakistan floods, what was in the newspapers are the terrible heat waves in North India. And land is going to become increasingly unarable. What happens with the extreme weather events, even on the shorter time scales, we found from a work in India, is that there is immediate wage disruption. Right, when we're thinking of climate change and we think of reskilling people and preparing communities to move, we're still thinking coal miners, we're thinking formal sector. The vast majority of workers in the most vulnerable populations around the world are in the informal sector. They are daily wage earners. No one is really responsible for them. And what both recent floods in South Asia as well as the pandemic showed is that extreme food insecurity sets in within days to weeks if your wages are turned off. When wage workers were locked at home in India in March, April, May, June 2020, it was really hard to figure out how to feed these people because government rations, when you give them food, were grains, but the flour mills were shut. Were they supposed to chew the grain? You know, and then restarting as the supply chains failed and industries didn't recover, restarting all these workshops that people worked at was nearly impossible. So this idea that we build back better is a fallacy, right? You're cascading crises, as we will see in South Asia. We don't recover from these floods. There will be something else that'll happen. And you just don't have the timeline you need to get back to baseline. I think that is the challenge. And so what South Asia needs to be thinking about, and it is not right now, is the fluidity of work and mobility across the region. If you look at what is politically happening in the region, we're talking about more walls. We're talking about detention centers. We're talking about using criminal languages for the other. And we're completely not prepared for what we need to be doing, which is figuring out how those that are forced to move can move so with dignity. And those who are unable to move and want to move are able to live on with dignity where they are. Managed retreat requires decades of planning. And I'm afraid that we have not even begun to start thinking about this in South Asia. We cannot even do it in Florida, you know? So how do we expect these governments to have the wherewithal to start thinking about it?
Thank you. That's great. Phuong, can I ask you in a similar way, what are the key considerations and challenges that we face in addressing the impact of war on population? Also, how is climate change affecting humanitarian response in addressing these challenges?
Thank you. You know, I think Satchit just touch on a very important part is this, you know, this notions that I think some of the things that's happening in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and even what's happening to us is recently with COVID really tells us what we need to do right now to prepare for the future. We see that, you know, it demonstrates that, you know, we as public health practitioner, researchers, or policymaker, we can't solve some of our problems alone. We need strong partnerships, strong collaborations. We need to be at the table negotiating some of these policies that you're mentioning, pre-positioning negotiations on movement if we have to move. Just look at Ukraine. Over a period of 4 weeks, we had over 4 million people that moved across the border. That's going to happen when a disaster hits us. That's going to happen. And we're seeing this right now, even in the Sahel. People don't talk about Sahel. But in Sahel, over the course of 1 week, we had 1 million people displaced in Burkina Faso. It's just enormous, and it's fast, and it's rapid. And I think this is why I think it's so important for us as public health practitioner to focus on this. And, you know, Satchit's right, that we can't rebuild better, but we can transform. And I think some of the things that, you know, that is at our disposal is, Satchit mentioned one of them is data ready, right? But we also have to prepare tools too as well, and make tools that are available. We know that in any kind of field, we need data. We need data to drive our decisions. And one of the things that I do a lot is work on global toolbox. And I resist a lot of temptations to privatize that. We make that in open source, freely available to everyone. And the reason why we did that was we wanted people globally to have access to a free open source tool to collect data when they need it and manage it, to visualize it, and to help them use it when they generate data. We think data equity is important. And I think that, you know, this aspects of trying to make tools and data available is really important for everyone, especially in countries that are less economically resourced. So I think and I think climate change we need to look at that. I think we're going to enter right now in a stage where people are really disaster or crisis fatigue with COVID. We're seeing one crisis after the other, and then we're also having, you know, this economic recession, predictions of economic recessions. And so I think we in our field need to also expand who we look for as sources of our work. So I think building this private sector partnership will also be something important for us to look at, and some of the challenges that we probably have to consider as we move forward.
Thank you. Michael, how do we increase the resilience of health systems, particularly related to developing the leadership that's needed to deal with the crisis, and also some of the emerging training needs in situations like these?
Sure, thank you. The health sector, there's a few sort of points of recognition that we have to realize in conflict as it relates to rebuilding the health sector. First is this issue of access and understanding that we have to have some degree of access both in emergencies and in sort of more chronic emergencies. The second one is understanding that health is polysectoral and actually widely dependent on economic structures, on social structures, and all the rest, including healthcare itself, which is broad and includes public health preparedness, public health monitoring, and public health systems, as well as curative health systems. So some of the, I guess, opportunities as it is to enhance healthcare resilience or the ability of healthcare systems to manage threats. There's a couple themes involved. One is actually investments into the span of healthcare coverage from public health all the way to curative health services, and not making those upside down. In other words, focusing only on curative health systems is, I'm an emergency physician, but I would never say that we only need to invest in emergency medicine. We need to invest in the larger healthcare system and the public health system. So understanding the interconnected nature of healthcare and investing appropriately in the emergent and sort of post-conflict settings is a really important thing to do to help build resilience. Another one that's a concept that is, I think, long overdue in the relief community is this notion of localization. If you're in the humanitarian business, you'll hear this as a buzzword, but it's actually a really important and true one. And that is, localization simply means the investment into local capacity right off the bat. In other words, the wrong thing to do is send mobile medical teams out and expats out and Western people into our concept of what relief looks like is not real. The photographs that we see of, people from the West ending up in Somalia is just not real. What's real is actually taking training programs, investments, and then building local capacity to make sure that when the relief dollars go away and the longer term hard development efforts are underway, that the money and the effort has stayed in the country. So this issue of really focusing on local capacity building, both materially and also from a leadership perspective. HHI works in virtually every conflict area around the world, and we have just this week, actually, we hosted a large and important UN program for all the senior humanitarian leaders. These are the people that lead humanitarian action in Syria and Yemen and Tigray. And those humanitarian leaders from the UN and NGOs have come to Harvard for a leadership development program. And that leadership development program is focused not only on those level of leaders, because they're global, international level leaders, but also on local leaders. And so we have a large program that builds local leadership capacity in all of these conflict and crisis areas, so that when COVID hits or access gets restricted, they're still there, they're working, and they've built their capacity. So the big one is actually just, I would say, localization.
Fantastic, thank you. Perhaps we have a few minutes left for one quick round of questions, if that's okay, before we open it up for everybody else to ask questions and comments. Satchit, if I can ask you, you've worked in some of the most pressing humanitarian challenges in the past decade in Iraq and South Sudan, and with the Syrian refugee camps and the Rohingya refugee camps. What has changed in the last 10 years what remains to be done? What's working? What's not working?
Thanks. I'll build on what Mike said. So 20 years ago, my first day of school here was September 11, 2001. It was Monday morning, and we watched the planes go down in Kresge cafeteria. And since then, building off work that Skip Burkle and Mike and Jennifer started, we were focused on exactly what Mike said, that initial temporization, that the humanitarian response then, 10, 20 years ago needed to be professionalized. Physicians couldn't go backpacking around the world. And we literally did this, right? You had people that would volunteer. Haiti was the worst example. And you would just show up. And since then, HHR alums have seeded international agencies and there's local capacity. But the one thing we've also recognized is all of this, right? The idea that you establish minimum standards of giving people food security, health services, education, was always supposed to be temporizing. It was a bridge, right? And this came out of the Second World War and the refugee crises after the Second World War. And finally, these folks needed to be assimilated. What we are left with today is multi-generational refugee camps, not multi-generational because 3 generations arrived there. It's because people became grandparents in these refugee camps. You have newspapers in the Dadaab refugee camp, right? So two quick stories about sort of what is most challenging. When this was the FXB Center had sent a team to Amman, close to the Zatri refugee camps, where the Syrians had come over into Jordan. The Syrians had a choice, at least not on paper, but they could either go to Zatri or they could be self-settled in Jordan, right? Meaning, if you choose to just go off on your own and pay rent, you basically then give up your formal refugee status or at least easy access to UNHCR services. And yet you are sort of in this legal no man's land where it was unclear whether you should be allowed to work or not. This is in the early days. And we were interviewing a family where there was this big, burly, middle-aged man with his wife and 3 kids, very proud. And they were living in a small sort of little rental room or 2. And there were 3 of us, my colleagues Josie and Kathleen were with me, and they wanted to offer us tea because people who have very little always want to share what they have. But they had 2 cups of tea. And so they served 2 of us, waited till 1 finished, and then brought the 3rd cup out. And halfway through the conversation, the man started crying. And you can sort of imagine the cultural burden of this very proud, middle-aged, Middle Eastern man with his wife and 3 kids, weeping in front of strangers, 2 of whom are women. And he says, all I want to do is work. I know I can support my family, I just want work. In the Rohingya refugee camp, I met a kid who said, can you send me some books? And I sort of got into a conversation with him. And I said, what are you studying? He said, I'm in 8th grade. I said, you look, old enough to not be in 8th grade. He said, yes, but UNICEF schools are only till 8th grade in refugee camps. And so I just keep going back to 8th grade. This is the 3rd year that I'm attending 8th grade. It speaks volumes about us, right? We've not figured out what we are going to do with people on the move. Our solution is containment. Build walls, build refugee camps, keep them in until we run out of dolabs, and then we don't have a plan B. There are many innovations that are in the pipeline, and I think we need to stay tuned. Jordan tried special socioeconomic zones to allow Syrians to have work permits to work. Uganda is a very successful example of how to integrate refugees. Europe is doing a better job. It goes back to the previous question of climate change. People will move, and we need to figure out how to give people the ability to work. Our humanitarian response does not respect the right to work.
That's great. What an answer. If I can quickly ask you a couple more questions, one each. How is the public health linked to peace building and development, and what's the role of public health practitioners in mitigating the effects of war and conflict?
Yeah, Satchit touched on a very interesting topic and mine too about, war happens when the system breaks down. There's fragilities, imbalances and instability. And, and health and the well-being of the community is the preconditions for peace. Anytime you can achieve peace for a few days or a few months, but to sustain it, you really have to restore these imbalances. And I always thought that, we in public health field, we're equipped with really good tools. Our model is always about prevention, right? Before the disaster happens, before the crisis happens. Those same set of tools can be used to resolve some of the crises, like the preparedness, all of these preparedness issues, setting up this framework that allows people to restore the dignities. Something that people also always ask about, especially in all of these crises, is about opportunity, not only for jobs, but education as well. And, Satchit mentions about this pre-contract, but also negotiating how do we, negotiate contracts where kids can get back in school or still obtain the educations in these temporary housing is really important because that's helps the parents, but it also helps the children. So there's a lot of investments right now in early childhood educations and preparing kids for having the continual educations in the field. So those are really important. And always think about our prevention model in public health, and we can use that in some of the preparedness for disasters and preventions of conflicts.
Thank you. And Michael, how do we rehabilitate a system after a crisis?
So I'm going to do that thing that I'm not going to answer the question and do something else. So sorry about that. But
No worries.
I wanted to it kind of answers that. And that is that I think many of you could wonder what's the purpose of the School of Public Health at Harvard have anything to do with war and conflict, because we're pretty far away and we're in this place, and what a wonderful legacy of leading in public health. And the issue is getting back to what Satchit just said, and that is professionalization. So we believe that the humanitarian sphere is immensely complicated. It's immensely multidisciplinary, and it's very difficult. And it deserves professionals, not cowboys. And I grew up in the era of being cowboys. And one of the things of my great embarrassment is to go to a place where I thought I was a well-trained emergency physician, show up in a Somali refugee camp, realizing that I knew nothing. I'm worse than knowing nothing because I didn't even know I didn't know nothing. And so realizing that probably not only me, but much of the humanitarian sector, we're just making it up and just showing up, which just had to stop. And the way that it stops is by building a pathway for professionalization. And that pathway has to do with actually science and understanding science and evidence and leadership and the development of professionals in the humanitarian sphere that actually can go then lead in organizations in the UNHCR and in the World Bank and the World Food Program and in other UN agencies and in MSF and CARE and SAVE and AmeriCares, right? So the way this is done is not just to depend on people just showing up and acting like they can do it, but actually developing professional pathways. And that's exactly what we do. And I'll just call out and thank Dean Williams for her vision in this, because she gets it and she supports HHI and our efforts in trying to build these generations of humanitarian workers that understand the importance of evidence and measurement and the complicated issues around international humanitarian law and access and all of the issues that will actually really help make the professional work that we do in the humanitarian sphere actually really worthy of the needs of the people we serve. So I've mentioned a couple of things in my messages. One was the challenges we have in access. The other one is the need for building localized leadership and localization. And the third one for me is just professionalization of the humanitarian sector. So thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. With this, if I can open it up to all of you, any questions that you have, any comments. If you have a question, please use one of the microphones, say your name, and then your question. Please, if you'd like to start.
And I want to ask that it becomes temporary. And there's a reason why, and particularly and just the countries that actually said refugees are vulnerable. Because we believe that if refugees actually settle in these countries, they can actually, of course, children in their countries. And so I think it's important that someone needs to look at the picture. And I think that's I want to ask another question. Neutrality between challenge, what was the reason?
Yeah, great. I think the question is, if you didn't hear it, what's the big shift that went from humanitarian neutrality and the perception of aid workers being neutral and the perception now of aid workers being targeted and directly targeted? And a lot of it is, well, there's multifactorial. Well, one is complicity with big Western powers, right? So that if we are funded by the West, funded by the American people at USAID, and that USAID does terrific work, but the identity of a humanitarian provider being funded by a US agency linked to the military is a big one. The conflation of military and NGOs being kind of the same, and they look the same and they act the same. And also then the fatigue, the political fatigue of organizations who are, like, say, in Somalia and Sudan, realizing that aid workers are there for 20 years and they have deep pockets and they have access to resources that can be exploited. So it's, radically changed, actually, from the idea that humanitarian aid can be neutral and participatory within a community to being non-neutral and transactional and in many cases targeted.
We had a question, please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Rebecca Ramirez. And I use a specialized healthcare technology to provide primary care services to rural areas in the state of Ohio. And one of my questions is, listening to the conversation, especially around access, I'm wondering what kind of infrastructure is present or available for virtual services in care. What does that landscape look like in terms of access issues that are discussed?
Do you want to take that again too?
Yeah, I think we all might have something to contribute there. Telemedicine goes only as far as what you can then do locally, right? So I think that's what a lot of folks outside clinical medicine are still not recognizing. I don't know what it is. It's like they have this image of the physician from 50 years ago who, takes your pulse and diagnoses everything about you. And they think that if you zoom in with a physician, you'll solve everything. But it has to be a part of a bigger system that has point of care diagnostics available and access to drugs and interventions. So a B2B model almost works better than a B2C model sometimes. And I think we're at the cusp of this. We'll figure it out. But in wars and conflicts, I think Syria was a very good example. When they started bleeding physicians and physicians started fleeing, there was such acute task shifting that had to be done where people were on, this was pre-pandemic, pre-Zooms or whatever was the video facility that available. People were talking to physicians in London and the US and directing surgeries, right? I mean, these are extreme and rare examples, but I think we're at the cusp of it, and the potential is huge, not just in war, I think in terms of peace too, right? We need to figure out how to expand healthcare access.
Maybe I can just add to it because I when I worked in the Congo about 20 years ago, people were talking about whether we should put computers there as well or internet. And so we worked on a Leland initiative where we actually started installing internet connection, VSAT satellites, and all of these. I think we should start preparing. We should start investing in those, and I think that's. And then I think people are having access. They have access to cellular phone, and they're beginning to have access to internet. And there are a lot of sophisticated tools out there for us to connect. And I think this is part of the data equity, digital equity issues that we should push. And I think we should prepare these locations, even though the infrastructure is not there. We should invest because when we're not there, that's how, like in Syria, we were talking about this. where actually some of our team were beaming in, helping continue, because there was a lot of physicians who led, and who was left were students of medical school and treating other, and so they were, trying to get some of these instructions from others. And so I think if we can invest in those and start laying the groundwork so that we can do things and assist remotely, it will be the key. And I think we have to think like 20 years ago, like, why do we need internet? Why do we need computer? We know now why. Right?
And just to add on, the greatest opportunity is not so much clinical consultation, because to Satchit's point, it doesn't, there has to be a technology match on the actual receiving end, but medical education or education in general, like that's a huge one, because what's happened is the erosion not only of healthcare systems, but any system largely is the brain drain and the destruction of education that Satchit just mentioned as well. And so having technology that supports educational pursuits is actually super valuable.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. I think Anthony.
Thanks, Rashad. I'm Anthony Diaz. Typically, when public health is focused on conflict, it's been a focus on poorer nations that have limited resources and is deploying from the West to tackle the challenges. Given Ukraine and the changing landscape in the key players, how do you see the role and the impact of public health changing, given the stakeholders are no longer poorer nations?
Goes back to the first observation. Vulnerable populations are often, subject to millions pouring in. We saw this in Bangladesh for sure, and Lebanon is a great case in point, which sits somewhere in the middle, right, economically, where the population goes up by 25%. Imagine if the United States had to produce 25% more schools, more sewage, more hospitals, but we can't do it, right? I would sort of flip that question and say, isn't it interesting, given who the stakeholders in Ukraine, what the response is, and how folks were driving their cars to the borders to take these families inside? No one was flying chartered planes to Dhaka to rescue the Rohingya refugees. I think that's a deeper, uncomfortable question we really have to ask. And Mike, you went through Kosovo and you saw the response then.
And just, I think it probably any discussion of the public health impact of war right today would not be complete without acknowledging the fact that Ukraine is much different and mismatched in terms of resources, right? The humanitarian appeal for Ukraine was what, 4.8 billion or 5.4 billion or something crazy. And actually, we are now in the midst of a famine in Somalia, right? And so, which is far more deadly, and there's so much more to do. So I think that the investments into public health have to be seen globally rather than simply looking at a place like Ukraine that has different needs and certain needs, but at the same time not nearly the depth of need that we have in the Sahel and around Yemen and elsewhere in the world. So it's important to look at it holistically.
Thank you. I think I see a lot more questions. We don't have the time, unfortunately. Let me just finish up with saying, I'm sure people would like to follow up with you. How can people learn more? People here, as well as those who will be hearing the recording afterwards, how can they learn more about the work that you're doing? Maybe you would let us know how they can follow up with you and learn more.
Yeah, I mean, we are available. So the HHI is a website and all of our emails are on it. So if there's anybody that has an interest in a particular area of interest, i.e. telemedicine question or others, we're delighted to connect. And we have lots of people that can probably connect as well.
I think, so the HHI websites, and also if you're interested in COBOL toolbox, we also have our websites there, and also you want to look at the tools, you're welcome to do that as well. And we also have our peacebuildingdata.org website.
A lot of our work is archived at crisisready.io, and I'm sure we'll have all our email addresses.
Wonderful. With this, I need to wrap up the session. So first of all, I'd like to say that this session was recorded and it will be sent to you after the weekend, so you will be able to listen to it and be able to follow up if you'd like. In a few minutes, we have the next session starting here, which is alumni lightning talks. So it'll be in this room. Outside, we have coffee, we have water, snacks, and we're starting in a few minutes. So please grab something if you want and come back here for the next session. But finally, if you would join me in a big round of applause for our speakers. Thank you.